Hi, I'm Paul Verschuur, and together with my colleague Bhavani Rao, we are speaking with Dr. Deepa Narayan. For over 25 years, Deepa advised the United Nations and various NGOs on issues related to poverty, gender, and development. She served as senior advisor to the Vice President's Office of the Poverty Reduction Group at the World Bank and has extensive experience with local, community-driven approaches to improving the quality of life.
Deepa, maybe to start our dialogue and analysis of collaboration, maybe you can just describe with your background, your different roles, and how you grew into the person you are today with respect to these fundamental discussions around collaboration.
What a simple question.
Yeah, well, we start simple,
Okay, well, I'm going to talk a bit about my professional life, and then, of course, the personal is important. I've worked on poverty issues for the last 35 years. I've lived in villages for about 10 years. I've worked with women's groups. I worked with small NGOs, and then I spent almost 20 years with the UN and then with the World Bank. And at the World Bank, the last 5 years, I was senior advisor. My interest has always been value-based change. And at the time, I couldn't have articulated it like that, but that's what I've been interested in. And on personal basis, I come from a family of 5 kids, and when there are 5 kids fighting for attention and resources, you either compete or you collaborate. There are only 2 things, and I think it was mostly passive collaboration and sometimes active and intentional collaboration when we would gang up to get something out of my parents or out of, grandparents or something like that. And I've also studied collaboration, particularly in the area of poverty and women's groups, as well as what makes large-scale programs and projects work. Lastly, in the last 2 years during COVID, I've done a big piece of research interviewing men in India, highly educated men and boys, young boys going to school as young as 7 years old, are trying to understand what it means to be a man. What does masculinity mean?
All right. Well, that's a good one to keep for our conclusions, I guess.
I think it's central.
Central. Okay. Well, then we will bring it up earlier. But now, so before we go into the specifics, right? So what is collaboration and what is it good for?
I mean, there are many definitions, but intuitively, I think what it means is when 2 or more individuals or groups or communities or countries come together to achieve a shared goal with some degree of volunteerism. So it's not based on coercion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But so what you emphasize is shared goal and volition.
Volition, yep.
But if we talk about defining features of collaboration, would these be the 2 outstanding defining features for you, or would you see others?
For me, right now, what I would say, particularly based on the work on masculinity and then looking back at community-led development, where I did an analysis of hundreds of groups that succeeded at the local level, I would say that there are 2 things that are critical for sustained collaboration over time. And that is power and love. And most of development and most of the work on collaboration focuses on power and rules. And I think the missing ingredient is love. And that's what I've learned from the hundreds of interviews I've done with men and before that with women.
Mm-hmm. But now let's see what that then exactly means, right? So, so if we have goals, intention or volition, or absence of coercion, and love and power. What do these things actually then really mean? Because you also applied that to individuals, to groups, but also institutions and countries.
Yep.
Right. So now I have some sort of matrix structure, and
exactly.
I want to plug in your definitions.
Exactly. Absolutely. I knew you would do that.
I'm so predictable.
So that's perfect. I think codification is important to achieve large scale success. But I think in everything that I see, there's been one missing ingredient. And the missing ingredients are things that we can't see. So I think what's been missing and needs to be spelled out in collaboration is the underlying values and human passions. And that's kind of hard to put into boxes, right? So let me talk about the framework of power and love, which is what I'm going to be calling Feminism X. Resulting from these 250 interviews with men, and before that, 600 interviews with women, educated women. So, in terms of when you think about collaboration, it's you assume it's about shared power, right? There are two things that come out in terms of power. One is what kind of power, and usually it's been power over people, which gets into coercion, even though it's not meant to be. And the other kinds of power is power with, which is shared power, comes into what I was talking about, which is collaboration, in the way I'm talking about it. And the third kind of power is power within, or internal power. And I think we don't separate out these different kinds of power. And most of what we see, especially in large organizations, but also the community and the family level, is the first one, which is power over. So let me start with the family or with couples, and then you can apply the same framework to organizations. So why is it today that we still have 1 in 3 women around the world experiencing physical and sexual violence? 1 in 3, right? And no country is spared. It's in the West, it's in India, it's in Africa, it's in Sweden. So that is power over. And what's been totally lacking in feminism and in organization development is the other aspect, which is love. So what do I mean by love? Love to me is kindness, caring, compassion, and collaboration. So kindness, caring, collaboration, compassion. And without that, you can achieve collaboration, but when there are difficulties, it's going to fall apart or it's going to be sabotaged. So that the internal honoring of people and tapping into that is difficult, primarily because we've ignored its power. So now let me come to communities, right? So we talked about individuals. So individuals, what I'm finding, by the way, I'll just say this in terms of my discussions with men, is masculinity and power are completely intertwined. So when you ask them, what does it mean to be a man? It's all about power, being muscular, being strong. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the only song you can sing, it's rather limited. Right? No cisgender man talked about love as a core attribute of masculinity, right? But they were very comfortable talking about power. So when I talked to women and asked women, what are the 3 words that come to your mind when you think about being a woman? It was many women talked about love, nurturing, kindness, mother. And only 1 woman talked about power. So the problem is that power without love is abusive, and love without power invites abuse. And you can apply this at the organizational level, how a large company is organized and manages its workers, or you can think about it in terms of global collaboration or negotiation. So the thing about this whole setup is that collaboration happens when rules or boundaries are clear. And if the focus is only on formal rules and not informal rules based on trust and love and dignity, it falls apart. So the indicator that it's all about power is when there's lots of litigation, like in the US.
Mm-hmm. But there, you seem to see this dialectic between power and love.
Yeah.
Would that be yeah? And
yeah,
then
absolutely.
you also match that to the sexes, right? And
the challenge is how we have. I think each individual has both power and love within themselves.
mm-hmm.
But that the way society has defined masculinity or has defined male roles and female roles has divided it. It's outsourced power to men and love to women. And
Mm-hmm.
the problem is, how can both men and women integrate power and love within themselves and be valued for it?
Okay. On the other hand, I could also argue that love implies power.
How can you argue that?
Well, love is something
Explain
like love can be withheld, right? So that means with that I exert also power as long as the other is in need of that love. Right. So,
Right.
and similarly, the power of a carer over the one that needs care, right, in itself is also exerted as an expression of love. Right. So I'm not sure whether I can see what you're saying.
Yeah.
But if we dig a little bit deeper, I think these boundaries are maybe not as clear cut. Right. So is that something we should worry about, or you think for your analysis of collaboration, that's more academic discussion and not really?
No. I think the question you're raising is important. But what I'm saying is that if it's only love in the sense of caring, kindness, love does not mean anything goes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Love has to be boundaried. So when there's abuse, you have to have a boundary and say, no, it's not all right. So in that sense, love and power go together in sort of an infinity circle. But what I'm arguing has happened is that the two have separated.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me just say one more thing. So if you think about, let me draw the parallels between my work at communities, where we looked at literally hundreds of cases of community action, whether it was in irrigation or sanitation or childcare, and in large-scale projects, what we found is that what distinguished successful ones from not so successful ones was the clarity in rules of how to solve conflict. And so that comes back again to how do you manage power and love? But if it is only based on legal rules without goodwill, it still doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I understand. But that seems to hint at an underlying universe of traits and issues that go beyond the surface expression of power and love. Because, for instance, you mentioned trust, but maybe we also have to think of reciprocity, right? It's also about the risk people engage in. If you talk in the case of love, right, it's risk. But if that risk is reciprocated, then there is some sort of balance. So isn't that underlying force, if you want, not one of reciprocity?
Yeah. Well, love is, I mean, what is love? Love is really about trust, trusting that the other person is there for you, has your back. That's the expression that kept coming back from these interviews. Somebody has my back, right? So love is, the foundation of love is trust. And without that trust and attachment, nothing is possible. It gets into abuse and isolation, in violations, etc. And love is relational, right? So the moment it's relational, there has to be reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
And that reciprocity has to be consistent. So once you get into power and love imbuing each other, then you have other ways of enforcing collaboration or ensuring collaboration rather than total dependence on litigation and formal rules, agreements that you'd already made.
Right. But now, can you give examples of also how did you come to that insight? Right. So you looked at complex collaborative processes, and at some point in your mind, that penny must have dropped. Like, hey, this is the way. These are the dimensions in which I can analyze this. So how did that happen? What was the example?
That happened very, very recently. And because I'm also, my background is in policy. And in the policy world, you don't talk about love. It was a lot to talk about power itself, which is really from political science and sociology. And then psychology contributes individuals. Actually, it's a very good question. The penny dropped for me when I started looking and relooking at the patterns. And this comes back to coding, men's interviews. And one of the interviews that was most telling for me is actually two things. One is what I already told you. I realized at the end of 10 episodes. So rather than writing a book, I did a podcast called What's a Man? And one of the things when I was doing almost the last podcast was the realization that men had been so open about so many issues, about their sexual life, their work lives, all their problems. But love was something that they had great difficulty talking about. Even father's love, right? Or love as couples or love for children, etc. That was one. The second was this man who spoke about, who's very successful, who's a CEO of a large international company, who's very competitive, who's very proudly good negotiator and quite assertive or even aggressive. Aggressive, I would call, as using his words. But in his personal life, he said, I can't be aggressive. And so with my wife, I have to use a different approach. And what he's struggling with is he cannot stop competing. And when I talked to him about his friends, he said, there's never a time when I can drop my guard. When we as friends get together, we're still always competing in terms of who has more, who has a better wife, who has more money, etc. So I asked him, is there any time that you have, within you feel you don't have to be on guard? And he thought, and he said, when we're drunk. And then he started feeling sad about it, right? But that was a deep confession. And the penny didn't drop then. But then when I started thinking about what is really happening here, it was his inability to let go of competition because of the deep insecurity that if you're not constantly competing, you're not a man. And I think that's the problem in terms of male-female relationships, which is all about power, and love gets squeezed out. So how can you bring back love in here. And that's a struggle if I think of it in the power and love framework.
Right. But now, would that imply that in terms of collaboration, we also have to look at two realms of collaboration, one realm based on power and competition, another realm based on love? And
I think,
the two are really segregated?
no,
Okay.
it's this infinity circle,
Mhm.
right, that has to go round because I was really inspired by Martin Luther King, who talks about power. Power without love is abuse. I mean, my version of it is power without love is abusive, and love without power is anemic. And what I see is that power without love is abusive, and love without power invites abuse.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
I understand.
right.
But can you give me an example of it? Earlier, you mentioned, for instance, water management
Yep.
as early examples that you looked
Yep.
at. So can you reanalyze that example in these terms? How does that work along these dimensions of power and love?
So I worked a lot on both domestic water supplies in villages and urban areas, as well as irrigation. And if there is, you can have the rules of tail enders and people near the source of water. And the conflict is always between those who are close to the water and those who are further away, right? Because those who are close to the source use up more or can control whether the tap is on or not. Now, you can have all the rules about it, right? But if there's ill will, if there's no other connections, or social capital or trust between those groups, nothing is going to happen. You're just going to fight forever. So that goodwill that comes in through mutual relations in some other realm that then provides the foundation for reciprocity and trust. If the only relationship is through water, it's very difficult to hold when that resource becomes even more scarce. Right?
Okay.
So as resources get scarce, the fights get harsher and collaboration becomes a distant dream. And whoever is the strongest, whoever has the most money, whoever is going to use the most muscle and power wins. It becomes a winner and loser framework, and collaboration is a horizontal framework, or needs to be a horizontal framework for it to last.
Mhm. So you're saying in order to build collaboration, you first have to define, let's say, a neutral playground where there are no resources at stake to build trust, from which you can then again return to the situation where there is something at stake.
Exactly. And the easiest way to think about this is to look at a family or a couple, right?
Mhm.
Every family goes through ups and downs. And what is it that helps you survive? It's that reciprocity and trust and respect that can help you through. Without that, it's not possible to solve problems as they arise. And problems are going to consistently arise.
Mhm. But now, in case of the water management that you mentioned earlier, did you also look at certain interventions and how well they would work in building trust, or did you analyze this from an outside perspective? And did you see examples where it worked because people built trust in this neutral ground, and other examples where that didn't happen? I mean, how did you
Right.
come to that
Right.
insight?
I mean, there are different examples. One, there's a vast literature in irrigation. There's a lot of published literature.
Yeah,
But let me
sure.
talk about the 4 villages that I worked in very deeply actually in Timor, and which was very dry. And clean drinking water was a huge problem. And I spent about 3 years visiting these communities with the research team, and there were interventions, etc. Where did it work the best? It worked the best where men started supporting the women, because drinking water or carrying water, fetching water is primarily a women's job all around the world, right? So where the male leaders and the spouses wanted to support this effort, there it worked. But if the men were not supportive of this effort, it did not work. We went through the same motions, the same processes, the same meetings. They created men's groups, women's groups, and talked to the village leader, and there would be a facilitator who would go out, etc., etc. It did not last.
But then, was that because of individuals who would be disruptive of the process, or of a social factor of how the group overall was organized?
No, I think the group organizations were very similar, right? Because after a while, you learn what's needed. It was this underlying animosity or lethargy that led to systems not working. It's neglect, right? Because again, you have limited time, attention, and money. If they don't go into solving the water problem that women are facing, it's not going to happen. So does it become a priority problem because men also see it as a problem and are willing to put their resources and work with women to support it? That's what made a difference.
Okay. But now, so also Bhavani observed this in the chat. So now we understand a little bit the sort of personal level of collaboration and these dimensions of power and love. But earlier you also said that you see this cut through different levels of organization, also the institutions and even to countries. So how should I imagine power? We can imagine also at the level of countries, but how would love in that sense generalize?
Yeah. Let me talk a minute about power, because I think power also is not a unitary phenomenon. It has many different forms and shapes. And the one that we're most familiar with is power over, even though it's supposed to be collaborative. Organizations have countries have unequal power. Whether you look at the UN, there is a body that can has veto power, right? So it's not completely flat. So it's power, it's whether the power is equally distributed or not, that's one. And then within that body, if there is the love piece comes in, it's based on values of mutuality, respect, dignity, and kindness, caring. And what I see is that when that's not present, at the first sign of trouble, when conflicts arise, it takes a long time to solve it. Or people get squashed within and are not treated with respect. So again, taking the most obvious recent examples, most companies have wonderful slogans about mutuality, respect, worth, human potential, etc. Right? And yet the Me Too movement emerged out of these companies, and more is emerging, including from sports organizations where girls were abused, little girls were abused. That's not mutuality or love or reciprocity. So we think it's power it's a collaborative process, but usually it's power over. And where there is power over, there is very little scope for kindness, dignity, respect, and caring, compassion, which is together is the package of love.
But which country in the world do you believe right now gets the closest to that ideal? at this point in time?
I think that's very difficult. I think, and if you think in terms of human satisfaction, happiness, etc., you know the answer. It's always the Nordic. It's the Nordic bloc that emerges at the top. But in terms of violence against women, I was very surprised to see that if you just look at that indicator, even the Nordic countries don't do well.
That's
in
right.
the human development, in the social norms, I was shocked to see that the level of violence in India and Sweden was almost the same against women.
Right. Yeah, those statistics are not encouraging. You're absolutely right. But now, on the other hand, decisions at the level of countries are again made by individuals. These individuals act in groups. These groups are not necessarily that large, but these are groups of power.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, would then the difference, because now we can look at the situation you described earlier for the water management, where you said, well, in the social structure was the same. So maybe this can be individual disruptors. So also, do you believe at the level of countries interacting and collaborating, it will depend on individuals in these groups that exert the power that will make the difference?
I think it depends. It always depends on individuals eventually, but it also depends on. It depends on the more individual and the country motivations. I think you're going to see a sea of change as we change the conversation away from how do I call it, one-manship, right? And the reality is that the world is dominated by male leaders, right? And the COVID example shows that a lot of the countries led by female leaders actually did a lot better than those by male leaders. That doesn't mean that men can't change or male leadership cannot change. I think it can, but it needs to change again in terms of integrating these values of respect and dignity for all, rather than the goal of achieving my goal, being obsessed by achieving my goal at all costs. I think that's the problem, which is why some of these, whether it's the World Trade Association or large organizations, get paralyzed because it's hard to come to a decision to collaborate when interests and sizes are so different.
Right. But so this is then in some sense also a tragedy of this gender or sex related dimensions of power and love, because I understand, of course, that you're saying, look, ideally they're linked as in your infinity cycle, but maybe it is not really feasible. Maybe they are by necessity incompatible. Because take the example of the man you just mentioned who discovered that actually he was always competing. But in some sense, for that person to survive in the competitive environment, he will have been completely conditioned for his whole career to hide his internal state, to not reveal anything, because otherwise he will never succeed. Right? So that in some sense you have to deny a part of yourself in order to survive in that specific environment, which will preclude you ever returning to the other side of love. And the same might hold if you start at the end of love. Right? So do you see it's possible to bring these together in some balanced form, or would you say, and therefore men and women have to actually work together because they bring these different perspectives to the table?
I think unless we bring, as societies and as a world community, power and love together, we're going to become extinct. We already see that in the excesses of climate change. We see that in the excesses of billionaires when there is mass poverty around the world, including in the US. So I don't think we can survive without power and love coming together. I think the second thing is the operative word that you used is this is just conditioning, right? No child, no baby is born grabbing for power. It's total conditioning. And that's why I interviewed 7-year-old boys and 8-year-old boys and girls. If the gender training starts very, very early. And so as long as boys are being taught not to be emotional, we're going to get unidimensional men. And as men don't change, women are leaving men and choosing to live on their own. I don't think these are recipes for a happy or fulfilling or thriving world in which the environment is cared for and in which we care for each other. So I don't think it's a choice. I think it's an absolute necessity for survival.
Okay.
That we as human beings have to change.
Mm-hmm. But what?
And sorry, the last thing, may I just add one other thing, Paul? And I don't think I think it's absolutely the case that men and women have to be given more opportunity and space to come together with men in decision making. And both men and women, but particularly men, have to both be given the space and integrate love and power, because love and power is basically the masculine and feminine archetypes in which every human being has that, whether you're trans or whether you're gender fluid or LGBTQ or A+. We all have it, and it's socialization and cultural conditioning and expectations that have created this bifurcation that is harming both women and men.
Right. Now, as a challenge, you could also argue that there's a trade-off here. That if we want to live our full identity and our full potential, it would preclude any form of large-scale collaboration, because collaboration also always implies a compromise. It always implies a trade-off. Like, I cannot pursue all my immediate hedonistic drives and instincts because there's not a time constant at play. There are other drives at play from others, and I have to compromise. So there might be a trade-off here. While you seem to say it is sort of, it adds, right? But how can you be sure about that? Why is there no trade-off here?
I don't think there's a trade-off in terms of human happiness and survival, because I think we will make different choices. And I think what's really being called for is both for men and women, a more feminine leadership, a more caring leadership, a more caring person for which you don't get hurt and others don't get hurt. I think it's a different lens to look at. And that as long as we look at a lens of more, we're going to be back to the same manipulation without changing outcomes.
Okay. But now, so okay, we have to come together. Humans are facing massive challenges, right? This we don't need to discuss. So now we have to act. And you're also proposing we have to bring love and power together by also more parity in how power and love is distributed. So from an operational perspective, that would then suggest, okay, we have to redesign the United Nations. We need, let's say, an international body that in this more even-handed way structures collaboration on a global level based on these values of love and power. Is that what you would be advocating? Is that what you go to?
Having worked at the World Bank and seen the cost of constant reorganizations, I would say, yes, it's important to have large organizations reflecting these values, which they currently don't. And I think that's not the only way to bring about change. I think we need new organizations that may be more networks that provide the pressure to change from the bottom up, so that the top doesn't function disconnected from the populations. And you're beginning to see it, but I think that's what needs to happen, is that I think a lot of change can happen within organizations, and where it's not possible, I think you need counter forces to make that happen, to push for that. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US is a wonderful example of that, of how change is happening, not because the government thought of it or some large organization thought about it, but endless organization, endless networking and coordinated action, collaboration across time and place in the US, but not with clear leadership. The leadership is diffuse, right? So, which is a completely different way of thinking of a hierarchical organization, which one usually man at the top.
Mm-hmm. But now, this is then a bottom-up movement, right?
Yep.
Grassroots, which will require also a lot of communication and also education, if you want, because now indeed you want to respect the volition and the agency of every individual in that movement in order to create this groundswell for change. This is a little bit what I hear you say. Is that correct?
I think that's one way, and one effective way, because the existing organizations, including governments, are not listening and are actually excluding these voices because of historical reasons. So that needs to be redesigned so that individuals don't have to fight their lives, fight for basic rights, basic access to education or employment or housing.
Right. So, but then, do we have enough time for that? If we look at the crises that we're facing, and we would follow a bottom-up approach, so this would be challenge number one. Do we have enough time?
Well, it's not either or, right? You have to have these people sit in the movements, but the large organizations that are sitting on the power and money have to respond and have to change. And I think the most important way of bringing about change is, one, these structural changes, and combining that with changing people's hearts and minds. So I've been watching some of the environmental movements in Canada and the US, and that's what a lot of the activists have also come to, is that you can fight for years, but some of these, you need the demonstrations to create pressure. But at the end of the day, you have to deal with the heads, the CEOs of organizations that are also human beings. And if you can come to it with mutual respect while holding firm to outcomes, miracles happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's going to happen on a large scale, because the resources are at the sit in large organizations. Unless these large organizations change, it's going to be an endless fight.
But then, isn't there now an elephant in the room again, which is called power? Because in some sense, the bottom-up organization tries to exert power over the big organizations in order to get them to the table.
Yep.
Right? Is that not the dynamic here?
Absolutely. So it's a fight for shared power, right? That's what basically we're saying. So it comes back to power and love. Love without power invites abuse. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have power, otherwise you're not heard. Mm-hmm. That's the way the world is structured, is a hierarchy, with the people at the bottom not having power. And so we're asserting power through the power of numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
to change the dialogue, right? That's the only thing. It's voice, and it's the power of numbers, which is why from time immemorial, it's people's movements that have thrown over governments and kings and changed the world. And that's how it's going to be. But does it have to be that way? If the large organizations, if governments really are for people, which they're supposed to be, then they would be more reflective and give easier access to voices that are different from the direction that they're going.
Okay. But these are values, right? And
Absolutely.
These values have to drive a movement. But then I could imagine that the onslaught of disinformation is a massive threat to building trust among all these individual agents to build up a movement. So do you see this also as a liability, as a risk for this approach, or you think that that's not really a relevant factor?
I don't understand what you mean by this flood of information.
Disinformation. All the
Disinformation.
disinformation. Yeah.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
the
yeah.
disinformation. The disinformation is acting against love, acts
Absolutely.
in favor of fragmented power.
Exactly.
So this to me would appear one of your biggest threats
Yeah,
right now.
exactly. Disinformation is an instrument of control and power,
Mhm.
of asymmetrical power.
Yeah.
So,
How
so
are you dealing with it?
yeah, absolutely. How do you deal with it?
Yeah.
The only way to deal with it is, I mean, through every source of power that you have, through laws, through the courts, through coming together and having alternative sources of information. I mean, this is what we're seeing in the world right now: is the attempts to retain, contain, and deny people power by these huge information and disinformation battles. And that's exactly what's going on right now.
Mhm.
And in that,
Right.
there's love. It's all about power, power, power,
Mhm.
power over, right?
Mhm. So in that cacophony of voices, who is your ambassador right now? On
I don't
Facebook,
have.
on Twitter.
Who's my ambassador? Again, I
Well,
don't.
for this philosophy, for this proposal, right?
Well, I think it's all the people who believe in a better world and action to make it a more equitable, fairer world in which the planet survives.
Right. Okay. So now, um, so we have discussed a little bit the framework that you're proposing, and also how it is grounded in examples. But now we also went through a unique and devastating experience, and also many countries are still going through this COVID-19 crisis, in particular also India. Has this taught us anything fundamental, anything new about collaboration, how humans collaborate, or how humans fail to collaborate? Is there a new insight?
I think the new insight is very clear that desire for total control destroys. Unaccountable governments and leaders that are bullies, that are the furthest from anything that could be called feminine leadership, are the most dangerous creatures in the world right now. And so unadulterated grab for power against citizens is deadly.
Mhm.
Deadly in a very literal sense, which uses all the fascist techniques of disinformation, turning people against each other, lying, controlling the media, jailing people, or threatening to jail people, or misuse of laws. We've seen this play around the world.
Mhm. So then, given that, are you still hopeful that humanity will be able to realize sustainable large-scale collaboration?
I think it'll happen when we see ourselves on the edge of extinction, which is including flooding, whether it's in Germany, or mudslides or hurricanes, or 120 degrees and 40 degrees temperatures in the US in the West. Seattle has had the highest temperature that it's had over a century. And and it has to hit us. It's a tragedy, but it has to hit us close to home to wake up. But even then, we may not wake up, because if leaders continue to lie and deny that human actions and human greed is creating this turmoil in the world and melting of the ice, etc., I think we may, the planet as we know it may go extinct.
Mm-hmm. Right. But then with the approach that you're advocating, there's a certain amount of time required to build the counter movement and to try to recover what can still be recovered. So how much time do you think you will need minimally to regain a sense of stability in this world, to counter the current threats?
You're asking me about how to save the planet?
Yeah, in your program, how much time do you need? Because the point is, if you're going to tell me we're going to need 100 years to mobilize enough people, okay, then this is not going to be operational, and we have to look at compromises. If you tell me I need 10 years, we can say, okay, where do we start? Right. So in that sense, it is not pure academic. It's a relevant operational question.
I think I think there are lots of pockets of resistance and hope. I think it will take billions of dollars to connect and amplify these voices. I think the fact that people are waking up to the climate, I mean, there are twin crises. There's a pandemic going on, there's a racial inequity crisis, and there's a climate crisis. There is a gender, racial, basically an inequity income crisis, and there's a climate crisis. And the underlying factors of how we deal with it is very similar, right? It's human excess, human overconsumption, and governments that try and hide the truth from its citizens. Whether it's in China, whether it's in the US, whether it's in India, whether it's in Turkey or Brazil or anywhere else. This is what needs to change. And if we continue in terms of this imbalanced power, I think money resources play a huge role in shifting that power balance and shifting the voices while this grassroots movement continues to thrive. I think it'll take another 20 years before we see a big shift. And the shift can be facilitated by providing resources to amplify the voices of research, of science, of community building, of reaching across differences, whether it's gender or race or political ideology. I think we can see a sea change.
Mm-hmm. But now if it's 20 years, then in that time frame, we also have to deploy a massive educational effort, because these dictators, the power mongers of the world, also manage to grab power because people are influenced by simple messages, by simple conspiracy theories, because the uncertainty of reality and the uncertainty of the future is too complex and too threatening to comprehend. In order to manage that, we need education.
Yeah.
So how are we going to educate then these future generations in your philosophy of power and love to enable collaboration?
Yeah. I think education, a massive shift in education policies and content. Because right now, for example, in the US, there's a fight going on race theory, right? Critical race theory is being banned. And why is it banned? Because in most places, the lies have been bought by so many people who then comes back to feeling threatened, etc. So I think everywhere, and we looked into education. I mean, in particular case, in terms of gender and how boys learn how to be men in schools. And schools are teaching the same, are deepening the stereotypes of what it means to be a boy and a girl. So I think you're absolutely right. It needs a massive re-education of people everywhere in the world, and so that we will make different choices and think differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's actually quite a bit of research showing that when children get different messages in schools, their interests and their approaches impact the decision their parents make.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's because it comes from love. They care about the kids. It's very interesting. Men won't listen to their wives, but they listen to their daughters.
Okay.
And sons.
Okay. Right.
I think you've got to use every channel to change minds and to change hearts.
But you could also argue that this ability to operate in a collaborative fashion along the lines of love and power is maybe something also innate, something that also biology just equips us with, but it's culture and education that sort of distorts that balance.
Exactly.
Is that how you look at it?
I agree completely, because I think the evidence from evolutionary biology, etc., is also coming out more and more that we're actually wired to collaborate, and we're wired to be altruistic and not just to compete. So yes, so there's been massive miseducation.
Right. So maybe the education effort should focus on sort of less education in some sense.
Yeah, the underlying premises of education are pretty messed up.
Right.
Because education was a form of, the most important role of formal education is to perpetuate the culture of a society, to reproduce society. So each generation, there are some changes in the external world, of course, but is perpetuating these false notions of who we are as human beings.
Right. Well, also don't forget that the basic model of the classroom goes back to Ferdinand the Great, and it is actually one of an authority, right? There's the authority of the teacher who controls the class. It's a upfront definition of an asymmetric power relationship in which education is defined. It already starts there. And that would be an easy one to change. But now, in some sense, what you're proposing as an ideological agenda could, a few decades ago, might have been captured within a religious context or within a political ideological context. But now, in our increasingly more secular society, there are voids. So do you see that what you're proposing is filling such a void that maybe 50 years ago would have been filled by people's religious commitment? But since these are gone, you have to again refill that space.
I hadn't thought about it in that way, because I think there's a big difference in the Western world and in Asia, for example, in Africa. If you look at the numbers from surveys on religiosity, in India, it's about 85%, so is the US. So I think it varies a lot. But in Europe, for sure, that I think there is a decline in church attendance, huge decline in church attendance. And so, yes, it is this, how do you fill the void?
Exactly.
And that void is this huge human longing for connection. We are wired for connection with other human beings. And the human longing is to be appreciated and to matter and to be valued as a human being. And then when that's violated, that's what creates problems for children, for adults, for men, for women. So it comes back to a very simple human longing to belong, to be appreciated, to matter.
Yeah, so that's where the virtuous life that also the classics, the philosophers, and the classic religions really were all about. What is the good life, right? And this is what you're reformulating. But then that's my last question. If you, by magical means, could change one thing in humans in order to help us achieve sustainable collaboration, what would this one thing be?
I would fill every human being with love. Love for themselves, so they feel loved and they feel they have supported by 100 people, and then let them go and do their thing in the world. It's this lack of love, lack of feeling appreciated and valued that destroys us as individuals and as a society.
Very good. Deepa Narayan, thank you very much for this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, you listened to one of our podcasts in the series on collaboration, produced by the Instrument Forum and the Convergent Science Network. You can find more episodes on our website.